Hi, it's Jen from Shabby Fabrics. Welcome to a very Merry Christmas Sew Along. I'm so glad you're here. We have several weeks of fun coming up. Hey, I love when we get to sew with a friend. I love being able to do the hobby I love the most with the people I love the most, and it just makes it that much better. So if you've got a friend that is someone you know that needs this kit too, let them know. Of course, kits are always limited. Depending on when you're watching this video, there may or may not be kits available, but I know as of late August, we still have a few on hand. So let somebody know to grab their kit, maybe even backings, and of course the Oops kit. If you have not grabbed your backing or the Oops kit, I can't encourage that enough. I've been quilting for decades now. I still make cutting mistakes. I still make piecing mistakes. I still grab for that Oops kit and use it. It just happens. As they say, we practice quilting, but I haven't yet mastered it. The Oops kit, obviously a low-cost insurance policy. Again, if you make any piecing or cutting mistakes, you can start again. Bonus is if you don't use much or any of it, you've got some fabrics for a coordinating project. Maybe you can take some of the blocks and make a small table runner, pillow, or whatever you're thinking of. So I'm going to go ahead and move those out of the way. Just like I said before, we're going to walk through every single block so that I'm giving you some tips and techniques. I'll give you options when I have an option to offer you. Sizing is going to be your friend. I put this out on here, and notice this can is almost empty. That's because we use it, and we use it generously to add that liquid and that sizing to our fabric, ironing it dry, and then and only then do we begin cutting. If there's ever a time to get a fresh blade in the rotary cutter, do it right now before you cut your first piece of fabric. You'll be so happy you did that. You get those clean cuts, and it just makes the block click together. The accuracy is undeniable. Patchwork pins, get them and treat that machine to a fresh blade. We've got the Schmetz top stitch. If you've got a favorite needle, whatever that is, go ahead and put one of those in the sewing machine, and now you're really setting yourself up for success. As you know, your kit's coming to you all in one big group of fabric. We have an image on the cover here. On the back, be sure to turn that over and keep that. That is a fabric key for you to use all through our journey together as we build our quilt row by row. Because the pattern, as we look at our pattern, Stacy Ishu, by the way, out there in Quilting World, thank you so much for once again making these adorable fabrics, writing a great pattern, and allowing us to have the sew along. If it wasn't for Stacy's designs, her fabric, and her kindness and permission for letting us have the sew along, this wouldn't be possible. So we are very grateful, and we can't wait to see what you're going to design next. Stacy, always exciting to see your fabrics. So in her pattern, you can see how she's calling them fabrics A and B, but they don't specifically have these fabrics in there. And I like that she does that. So if you just picked up that pattern, maybe you have a stash of fabric at home. That way you're establishing what your fabric A is, what your fabric B is. But for us, we use Stacy's original fabrics. This is her quilt, by the way. Thank you, Stacy, for letting us borrow that. And the fabric key is your guide to knowing what your fabric A, B, and so on and so forth is. Something else I want to call your attention to. Stacy has you in the pattern cutting all of the fabric up front in the very beginning. You can take that approach if you want. It is a lot of cutting. If you take this approach, it will be very important for you to label that fabric because some of the sizes are so similar, especially of the white background that of course is happening again and again and again. This is just the white fabric here, just that one fabric. And some of the cuts are literally different by just maybe a quarter or half an inch. You'd want to be sure that you're labeling that so that when you go to grab the fabric, you're grabbing the right cut of that fabric. The other possibility is you're just kind of cutting your fabric as we go along. as a group and make our row. So that's your decision of what you think you'd like to do as far as cutting those fabrics and getting them ready for us to sew, whether you want to cut everything up front and label or kind of cut as we go. So as we look at our pattern, the first thing that we'll be doing together is, let me just bring out our blocks. I know the quilt is big, so the top of the quilt maybe and the bottom, which is what we're working on right now, may be out of your view. So I've got a block of each. And so basically you've got the green block or what I'm calling the red block. And let's break it out. We're really going to build the block from the center out. This is a half square triangle and this is a flying geese unit. And of course these are just squares. So we always want to digest, how is this block going to be made? So let's start by focusing in on those half square triangles that when they're arranged form the pinwheel. And I'm going to give you a few options on that. In Stacy's pattern, in order to make 2-inch half square triangle units, which is what these are finished, the 2-inch, the rule of 7/8 applies. I don't know if that's a term that you know. This is obviously a sew along, but I'm also going to offer some education to you so that no matter what size half square triangle you decide to make, maybe on a future project, you've got some information to go into that may be helpful. The rule of 7/8 applies to half square triangles. And what that means is if you're going for a 2-inch finished, sewn into the block, half square triangle, as these are, you would add 7/8 of an inch to that, 2 7/8, and that's what size you cut your 2 fabrics to. And if you do that, you will be able to yield 2 half square triangles from those 2 squares. We like to upsize that. Instead of adding 7/8, we add a full inch. So if you want to finish with 2-inch half square triangles, we like to add a full inch to that and cut 3-inch squares because it allows you to have something to square up later. And you'll square that up to 2.5. And then of course, sewn into the project is 2. Stacy's instructions have you cutting 2 7/8. So just know if you take that approach, you won't have anything to square up. If you want to bump that up to 3, just be very mindful of the additional 1/8 of an inch fabric you're using. You should have plenty of fabric in your kit to do that. But just know that's a little bit of a deviation from the pattern. Yet still, I'm going to show you a way, once I show you the traditional way to make half square triangles, that we can be using the star singles and we would be using the 2-inch star singles. The 1-inch would be used later on, but if you are going to go ahead and pick up those star singles, if you didn't already do that when you signed up to get your kit, go ahead and pick up the 2-inch and the 1-inch because those will come into play here. These are little 1-inch half square triangle units that are sewn on the other side of a rectangle there. But let's talk about the traditional way. If you don't want to deal with star singles, how do you make a half square triangle unit that ultimately will become our pinwheel? Again, per Stacy's patterns, she's having you cut 2 7/8 inch, placing those right side together, and you're going to draw a line with any straight edge that you'd like from corner to corner, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of that line. If you want to take that idea of upsizing a little bit so that you have something to square up, you would be cutting 3-inch squares instead. Still drawing the line from corner to corner, still sewing a 1/4 inch on either side. That doesn't change. So we'll go over to the sewing machine. I have some aids on my machine. This is the Cluck Cluck Sew diagonal seam tape. I also have a seam guide, which has a nice ridge here. But for this one, as I line this up, notice how my black line is lining up, my drawn line is lining up with this. That is going to help me achieve a 1/4 inch away from my drawn line. And we'll sew that on either side. Okay, let's check and see what we've done here. I'm going to warm up the iron. When you're making traditional half square triangles, after you've sewn that 1/4 inch seam allowance, you will cut on that drawn line. And as a matter of habit, I press to the dark side. Whatever you decide to do, and I strongly recommend pressing to the dark side, be consistent. In order to have what's called interlocking seams, you'll want to press all of those in the same direction. So let's say you're sewing from home, maybe with your own fabric, doing a completely different half square triangle. You have maybe a light and a dark. Whatever you decide to do, do it the same, press toward that same fabric every single time. And that's gonna help us, and you'll see why that's important in the next step. These little flaps here, people call them dog ears, trim them away. You don't want any additional fabric in the block, because already on the back of any pinwheel unit, there's a lot of fabric coming together. Extra fabric that is not needed to make that half square triangle is not welcome. We want to reduce that. Now, I use 2 7/8 inch half square triangles. Technically now, this should measure, and I think I sew with a little bit of a scant, this should measure 2.5 inches. If it doesn't, I'm going to go in with my 2.5 inch, and I'm going to square this up. I was a little nervous about being short of my 2.5, and I think I sew with a scant. With the spinning mat, it takes a little bit of real estate to move everything. But I'm going to trim that up. I know I sew with a scant, because normally I don't have to trim that up. And that's that 2.5 inch. If you did this with 3 inch squares, you would have, of course, a little bit more breathing room to square up. Whatever approach you take, whether you use the 2 7/8 inch and sew with maybe a little bit of a scant, whatever that is, you want this to now measure 2.5 inches, of course, trimming that up. Let me just move that for now. This is your first approach to making half square triangles, but what is this business about star singles, and why does Jennifer keep talking about that on these videos? Why? Because it increases our speed. We can make 8 half square triangle units perfectly and never have to square up anything, because the way they come out of the star single is already perfectly at 2.5. So let's talk about that approach. Again, you have enough fabric in your kit to do that. So in this instance, you can see this is 4 half square triangles. One sheet of star singles will produce enough half square triangles to do 2 blocks, 2 of the green blocks. So I love that. Let's go ahead and bring that out. I'm going to move a few things out of my way here for the moment, just to have a little more space so you can clearly see what I'm doing. Star singles, you get a generous amount of those in the package. The instructions tell you exactly what to do. Half square triangles, 2 inch finished blocks. That's us. That's 2 inches going into that. Cut 6 inch squares of fabric. I'm going to give you a little bit of a pointer here. I like to cut big enough that my fabric fits the size of my paper. If we measure the size of our paper, we are at about 6 1/4. I like to upsize my fabric because I want to clearly make sure, that as I'm cutting, I've captured that fabric. I want to make sure I've sewn that fabric. When the fabric is only cut to 6 inches, it is well inside this line. Notice we upsized our fabric to about 6 1/4. Basically cut it to the size of your paper. Once you've done that, the next thing is place the two squares right sides together. And I've got one done here. Like, let me just unpin that and show you all of the steps on that. So you've got your fabrics, you've got your paper, you're placing them fabrics right side together. It doesn't matter which fabric is on top, which fabric's on the bottom, but they must be right sides together. On top, make sure you're pinning out in these open areas. And this tells us, place two squares right side together, place paper on top and pin. Sew along the dotted lines using small stitches. So I would pin. We will definitely reduce our stitch length on our machine to about a 1.5. The reason being is twofold. We want to add a lot more stitches along these sewn lines because we're going to tear this paper away. We don't want to destabilize the very stitching that we've just put into our block. We want more stitches in a shorter distance so that when we remove the paper, it's still solid. Our thread isn't going anywhere. By the way, we're sewing with an Aurifil today. I've got the white in there. But the second reason for showing on the shortened stitch length, in fact, I'll show it to you, is it perforates our paper. It makes it easier for us to tear the paper away. So it's a great thing on both instances. Sew along the dotted lines using small stitches and cut along the solid lines, tear away the paper. I love that the paper tells us exactly what to do. We don't have to remember that. So looking at this from the overhead camera here, we've got number 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So you'll just start right off of the paper on sew here. If your machine has a needle down feature, engage that. You want to stop and pivot right in that black circle. That's where the needle is down. And now you're going to pivot, come back down here, stop needle down, and you continue all the way around until you sew all the way off on 8. We've done that ahead of time. Hopefully you can see that here. That's what that looks like. Once that's done, remember the instruction was to cut on the solid line. Be very intentional about that. I'm going to end up with a lot of threads on me today, so just, and I know you will too, as we sew along together. Let's cut on our solid line. I want to show you the perforation. I think I cut just a little generous on that, but we're going to take a measurement check. And you'll see how accurate this is. And you don't have to square anything up in the end. Love that. I love that. Whenever I use star singles for half square triangles, pinwheels, my block always comes out better than when I try to go kind of old school with this. Very affordable, and a pack of that is, oh my gosh, I don't even know how many sheets are in here. There are so many in here. 100 sheets makes 800 half square triangles. That's a lot. So fold the paper back. You can hear it just kind of is perforated because of that shortened stitch length. This is a fun one. When I sew with a lot of half square triangles on using star singles, my kids, my husband, they all help me peel the paper away, and I'm always very happy to have the help with that. Again, let's press toward our dark fabric. And let's take a measurement check. Let's see how accurate those star singles are. Clean that off. We're going to grab our tool here. Look at that. It's dead on. I mean, that's undeniable. I'm not trimming anything up. I'm just ready to go. Once you have your half square triangles, and remember, when you do this traditional way, you always get 2. So in order to make a block, you would need to do that with 1 more pair of the white and the green, then you have enough to form your pinwheel. Or if you're going to be using the star single, you'll have 8. You'll have enough to form 2 pinwheel units. Go ahead and get those done, whichever way you want to accomplish that. In fact, I will need, this is what we're going for. Let me square up the other one, and when I come back, let me just square that. I don't want to take any more of your time with that. I'll use the star single. I want to show you how to lay them out and give you some pointers for sewing those together so you get a nice center point, which is of course what we're all going for. I'll be right back, and then we'll go right into how do we get a really nice pinwheel using our half square triangles. So we have our 4 half square triangles. I've confirmed those are 2.5, something you definitely want to do. Just lay that on there, just double check. Again, if they're under, you're going to battle with that block the whole time. That's what the Oops Kit is all about. Sometimes I'm so far downstream of a block, seam ripping isn't even an option anymore. You guys know if you've watched any of my videos. I use that Clover seam ripper more than I should, but I'm after a really precise block, especially if it's going to be something that I know is needed to go into a larger block as this is, right? So make sure you've got 2.5 inch. Once you do, step 2, I have sewn pinwheel blocks together wrong. I can't tell you the number of times because I didn't take the time to lay it out. I just kind of had my blocks here and I went to my sewing machine and I was convinced that I understood the arrangement. No, and then once again, I test out my favorite seam ripper. And while I do love the Clover seam ripper, I prefer to sew versus seam rip. So lay that out, make sure you have everything as it should be. We talked about pressing to the same color, whether it's the green or the white. In this case, obviously the green is the best choice. When I place these right side together, do you remember I talked about interlocking seams? Let's look at that. From above, we have a seam going this way and we have a seam going this way. This is one of the essential elements to having accurate blocks is interlocking seams is a great way to start off and set yourself up for success. The other thing I like to do, instead of pinning out here, is I like to pin along that seam so I can leave that pin in. I don't have to remove that. That's something I've learned along the way. So I'm gonna also make sure that I stack that right side up because another thing I've done is I put my pin in and as I went to my machine, I inadvertently rotated it and I sewed that side. Obviously, I'm back with my seam ripper again. Too many dates with the seam ripper. I want to have more dates with the sewing machine. So make sure you place that in the orientation where you know that's the side you're going to be sewing on. Here, when I place this right side together, while I do have interlocking seams, I don't want to start sewing down here. What matters to me about a pinwheel block is that center unit, and that's that part right there. For that reason, I'm going to turn this block over so I can start sewing in that center, right? That's the part that matters to me. Again, I have a beautiful interlocking seam. Whether you use the 2 7/8 inch or the 3 inch squares and took the traditional approach to getting to this step, or you use the star singles to getting to this step, we've already established that these need to measure 2.5. What that means now is it's all you getting to that 1/4 inch seam allowance in order to have this block come out the right size. So be mindful about your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you tend to sew on that chunkier side, which is my miss is always sewing a little bit more than that 1/4 inch. The seam guide setter may be your best friend. This establishes a bit of a scant 1/4 inch so that especially with a block that has this much going on, this is going to pay dividends for you. So I have that established in my machine that I'm a little bit on the scant side of a 1/4, which is going to help me achieve this block being the right size going into the larger block. Okay, so now we were pressing to the dark. Now we need to distribute that bulk evenly. We'll press our seam open. Some people have said, I don't like making pinwheels. My points never come together. That's why we're going to take a little bit of additional time to give you some pointers. Mine don't always come out perfect. In fact, maybe almost seldom perfect. They come out passable, I should say. I've had very few perfect pinwheels where everything is just, it just kisses right in the middle of that. But passable is what I would say mine have become. One of the other reasons I like to press that open is you see this place right here. That is the place your needle must pass through to capture your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let's lay our now partially assembled sections together. Placing this right side together, this is very important that now I'm looking from above. You're not going to just pin left and then left to right. No, you must pin here in the center because this is the most important part of what we're doing. We know all pinwheels are judged by that point, that confluence. Once that's established, I'm going to put a pin right along here that I do not have to remove. I'll also pin here at an angle and here at an angle. Let's sew a good honest scant, if not, a 1/4 inch seam, if not just a little scant of that. But the point is we want to hit that open seam where it's indicating we should hit with our needle. That's very important. Okay, the moment of truth is, did we hit that point? Let's look. I think we did. I think we did a good job of that. That unit should be at 4.5 inches. I wish I had a 4.5. In fact, I think I'll grab that if I've got that handy and do a measurement check on that. It's good to do measurement checks along the way to make sure that you're going into the next part of your block ready to go. If this is measuring a little under, just a breath, you're going to be okay. You can compensate. But if you're under it significantly, maybe not so much. So it is worth taking a measurement check on that. Maybe I'll just lay this on my mat here and see how we're doing. That should be measuring 4.5, and I'm happy with that. So as we said, with the star singles, you would have enough half square triangles to make 2 of those units. I love that. That portion of the block, get those pinwheel units ready, and we're going to move on to our flying geese units. The traditional way of making flying geese units, probably not foreign to you, is to simply draw a line on the back of the 2 fabrics that are basically on bracketing our white. And so, well, let me just do that real quick. And we would place those, let's think about that. If we want our block to look like that, we're going to place one of those in that corner, like that. And the other one would be, you need to sew on that line. In fact, let's just go do that. Let's make a traditional flying geese unit. And then I'm going to teach you a technique where you can make 4 at a time, far more precise. Again, it's another resource, not required, but is a great option, and that's the option I take these days for sure. Let's sew on that line. before I trim anything, I like to press to the outside and make sure that nothing moved. I've had that happen where all of a sudden when I press to the outside, you know, it looks something like that, and not passable. This should still have, that my white fabric should still have the same, should be the same size. It just now has a corner on it. Looks like that was cut to 2.5 by 4.5. It's the same size. Once you're satisfied, you'll want to roll that back. I'll use any straight edge and trim that with my rotary cutter. Now my other fabric, which I've seemed to have lost track of, there we go. This will go here, and we'll repeat that step. You get the idea. So on the line, once you're happy, press to the outside. Once you're satisfied, you'll go ahead and trim 1/4 inch away, and that is your block. Notice there was nothing to square up, and you're making each of these one at a time. That is the traditional way to make a flying geese block. But you know, people are very clever, and there's ways to do things that are more efficient and less waste. Notice how when I trim that fabric is wasted. I love this approach to making flying geese units. I get to make 4 at a time, and I don't have nearly the amount of waste, and I get to trim up. You can trim up using any ruler, or I'm going to be showing you how to use the Ultimate Flying Geese tool from Creative Grid. I no longer make flying geese units without this tool. It is undeniably accurate. My blocks are dynamite, and it's not because I'm that great of a quilter. It's because that tool makes the blocks just amazing. So I want to demonstrate that for you. This approach means that, in fact, let's look at our tool. Let's look at this so that this makes sense to you. The Ultimate Flying Geese tool, I love the versatility of it. Looking over here on the left side of this product, you can make flying geese units as small as 1/2 inch by 1. I can't even imagine. It must be a miniature quilt. All the way up to a flying geese unit that's 4 by 8. All of the information you need is on this tool, but of course, it will also come with the instructions included in any Creative Grid tool. Here, let's unpack this. In order to make this, notice how I have one piece of fabric here, and I have my squares, and I have actually 4 squares. That's what this is telling us. In order to make 4 flying geese units, you start with 1 piece that's larger in 4 of the smaller squares. In our instance, we know we want this to finish at 2 by 4. So we are letter D. To make 2 by 4 inch finished flying geese units, we will start with a 5 3/4 inch square, only need 1 of those, and 4 3 1/4 inch. Amazing, all right? What do you do with it once you have that? Okay, that's right here, and I'm just gonna take it literally from the beginning. You can place these in the corners and then draw the line if you'd like, or you can draw the line diagonally on each of them. I think it's easier to just place them in the corner and as a single action, draw that line. Now you're going to want to pin that in place and pin well. Some people, and what we did here, some people feel that the bulk of that overlap will come into play later with the flying geese block, and they don't like that, and therefore they go in once this is pinned down. In fact, let me just pin it for you so nothing's moving, and they trim. That's optional. Sharp. These are the extra fine pins for patchwork. Get the extra fine pins. I love that they stabilize that. These glass head, the head of the pin is glass. Sometimes I touch them with my iron inadvertently, and I don't want anything melting, of course. If you were going to snip that, you could literally just come in here and cut that away, right? And you're removing the excess. That's all you need to do. Again, I think that is probably an option, but it does reduce the bulk. If you want to pin again, then you can. We now need to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of that. Let's just go do that together. Okay, let me make some space here. Once that's done, as you would suspect, we need to cut that apart on that drawn line. And of course, we'll end up having 2 halves. Remember that in order to make the 4 flying geese units, we cut 1 larger square and 4 of those smaller squares per whatever the requirement is on the ruler, depending on the size of the flying geese unit that we're doing. We now have our 2 halves, and we'll make sure we press away from our larger white square. And it looks a little funny. You're thinking, where are we going with this? It's an amazing process. And once we have them pressed to the outside, the other 2 squares will come into play. You'll draw the line on the other 2. Any straight edge that you'd like to use. And these will go in these corners. Notice that's going right through that gap right there. Pin well, we don't want anything shifting. And with your second unit, you're repeating that. Once that's done and pinned in, I'm going to be sewing a 1/4 inch on either side. I'm going to go do that because I want to when I come back, I really want to zero in our time on now what? Well, now that that's sewn on, how do we square this up? How do we use the flying geese tool? There's 2 trim functions on that, and I want to be able to dial that in with you. So go ahead and sew, and you at home as well, a 1/4 inch on either side of both of those drawn lines. So just like before, we will cut apart on the drawn line and on both. And you can see this is how, with 1 large square and 4 smaller squares, we end up with 4 flying geese units. Isn't that fantastic? And they're a little bit oversized, which will give us a wonderful opportunity to be able to square that up. Every time I can oversize a block just a little and have something to square up, I am so much more relaxed. And the block, of course, comes out more accurate because I could trim up. Once we're here, let's talk now about this tool once again. So I want to flip that back over. You get a piece of I want a piece of white fabric or paper so that you can see what's coming next. So we used our diagram over here to understand what are we cutting our fabrics to, and of course our instructions inside our Ultimate Flying Geese tool were showing us how we had our white square and our 2 in the corner, draw the line, all of those steps. But the rest of the information now is on this. Trim 1, and then there's over here, trim 2. Remember how for the 2x4 inch rectangle, flying geese unit, we were letter D. That's who we are. Trim 1 in order to use trim 1 and know where to line up, you need to know what letter you are. And that means like, okay, what size flying geese? We're going for a 2x4 inch. See the D right here. Notice the dashed lines. And notice right there, it says 2x4. This is what that means now. Move this out of the way. Is with our units that are oversized, we will bring our ruler, there's our D, and I'm going to scoot that right up into that slot. Notice I have two sides exposed that I get to trim at the same time. That's the trim 1 function. Trim 2, once we get to that, we'll be trimming the other two sides. So I have this beautiful alignment right here. Trim 1, and you can see this works beautifully with a spinning mat because I don't want to move my fabric right now. Once you find the sweet spot and you believe you're lined up where you should be, ideally you don't pick up the fabric again. Rotate this one more time, and now this puts me in position for trim 2. And I'm going to show you that real fast. Let's give it a piece of paper. Trim 2, A, B, C, D. Sound familiar? That's us. That's the framework of it, and there's our slot. So we'll scoot this down right into that saddle. There's D. I'm looking for that. But notice what other alignment I have. See this dash line, and that says 2x4. You might not be able to read that. It says that. This is how I know I'm in the right location, absolutely, to make my next 2 trims. That block is perfectly prepared for going into my block. I would be unlikely to achieve the same level of precision. I might get close with my sew and flip technique, but not as dialed in, and just everything is just beautifully trimmed up. So as we measure this, it's ready to go beautifully into that. All right, I think I need to trim the rest of these up in order for us to lay our block out. I will do that off camera. Then we'll lay out our Flying Geese units as well as our squares in the corner, our pinwheel, and we can talk about that block assembly. So we have our Flying Geese units all trimmed up, and now we can lay out our block, my favorite part. Grab your pinwheel unit. You have, of course, your 4 corners that are just squares. And now we begin sewing rows together. I'll start off really over on this side of placing that fabric right side together. And when I approach this, I'm always like, okay, do I sew from this side or should I sew from that side? Go ahead and consider that. The advantage to sewing on this side is that seam is down and moving in the same direction as my presser foot. I don't want to have something called rolled seams. They disrupt the ability for a block to lay flat. I've got plenty of rolled seams on some of my earlier quilt blocks because I didn't consider what side to sew from, and I wasn't careful about making sure I didn't have any rolled seams. On this one, placing them right side together, I could sew from this side or this side. I like having that bullseye of where that needle should be passing through. So I am going to sew on this side. Let's pin that in that intersection. Now this just comes down to, again, that very accurate seam allowance, whether it's the quarter or slight scant as you prefer. And I'm going to get things ready to go in groups to the sewing machine. Now down here, do I sew from this side or let's check this side? In this instance, notice my seam is pressed this way and I'm traveling this way. I'm going to sew this one from this side. These are some of the more advanced things that I've learned along the way of not getting rolled seams and considering what side should I be sewing from. So let's go sew that. Okay. Pressing is a thing. Again, I'm very self-taught with quilting. I remember going to the library when I was interested in quilting. That was way before YouTube. So I was a pilot at the time with a little one. I did not have time to take quilting classes. So I learned from a book in the library, and I kind of was winging it. as time has passed and I've learned that pressing is important, pinning is important, which side are you going to sew from is important. These are all the things that, you know, maybe if you two are kind of self-taught, are things that might be tips and techniques that are going to increase your accuracy with those blocks coming out and those points coming out exactly as you would like. In this instance, you can see that there's no question I should be pressing toward this because there's a lot of bulk going on with all of the seams of this Flying Geese unit and nothing going on over here. Go ahead and go with that and press away from that Flying Geese unit. And we can set that back into position. Here, let's see what we should be doing. I think we probably pressed that seam open. We did. That makes sense, right? When there's even bulk to be distributed, you could potentially press toward the middle, but this looks like we pressed open here. I'll follow suit. But pressing is something to consider. Some patterns don't even give you pressing information. You're kind of on your own to figure that out. And it is something to consider. So let's lay that there. And then again, on this one, we want to press to the outside. The reason I warm up those seams, I should have talked about that before now. It just seems that the fabric is a little more compliant, a little more willing to go in the direction I'd like it to go in when it's warm. So that's really the reason that I do that. So we've got the right side of that. And again, here on this side, the same story. These will be coming right side together, and you're deciding, should I sew from this side or this side? Well, the seam is going here. So once again, let's sew on this side so that that seam that's pressed down stays there. If we sew on this side, the presser foot may catch that or the feed dogs and roll the seam back, which would end up with us seam ripping that, and we would need to sew it again. So let's set ourselves up for success and sew from this side. From here, again, I really liked having that target on this side. We, of course, want to make sure we believe that's going to hit right at that point, so we capture that. That's where you'd want to pin first, pin in the corners. Do that. Get that lined up here a little bit better. And I just try to visualize that point lining up with that. And we pin here and then over in those corners. So this is just like we just sewed on the other side. Nothing different. But again, I'm considering what side should I be sewing from, and then this side here. Let's take a look. Should we sew from this side or that side? Well, my seam is going this way. I'm definitely going to be sewing from this side. Let's just go do that. We've gotten this far together. Let's go complete that. 1, 2, and 3. Let's go sew. Okay, let's see how we've done. When I'm sewing the units together, I'm sewing slower. I'm more concentrating on that seam allowance. When we know that we're going to have a block that's oversized and square up, I sew a little faster because I know there's leeway. But once things are squared up and now it's coming down to the final stages, I definitely encourage you to slow down. Happy with that. Again, let's go ahead and press the seam open. Lay that back out. And then finally, our last row, of course, pressing to the white and down here. And just like before, here, what's important are these points coming together. That's what's important to me. So we will focus on that. Pinning here, and then pinning anywhere else. Same on the bottom. Pin in the corners, of course, right side together. Pinning in the corners, a good solid 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then pressing those seams open, and our block is done. I love that it's the beginning and the end of our quilt. I love that. And everything else is kind of sandwiched in between. So I hope that you're learning some fun tips and techniques, maybe things you've never tried. Give it a try. Maybe use some scrap fabric and decide on your favorite way to make half square triangles. Is it with star singles or not? Do you prefer the traditional way to make flying geese, or you want to give that flying geese tool a try and see how fun and efficient it is to make 4 at a time? And of course, some good piecing techniques, maybe some seam guides, and maybe the Cluck Cluck diagonal seam tape is a good aid to help us really dial in that 1/4 inch seam allowance that helps us turn out those accurate blocks. Once you have all of those together, each row of our quilt should measure, I believe it's 50.5 inches long. You are going to want to take a measurement check. Notice that the blocks, there are some rectangles that are separating those blocks. If you measure your row and you discover that your row is under 50.5 inches, you can always add something called coping strips. Basically what that is a little bit of the additional white fabric you cut to sew on the end of those rows, or you could even bulk out a little bit of these rectangles if you needed to make that 50.5. If you are under by, I don't know, 1/4 inch, you will be able to feather that in as we work through our rows. Don't worry about that. But you do want to take a measurement check, and if you need to add a little bit of a buffer of maybe adding a coping strip, maybe sliding some in here, you could do that to help grow that row to the length it needs to be. All right, I'll be back with our second row coming up. It looks like we have this really fun unit here. Very straightforward. I'll be giving you options on that, as you can expect. If you haven't already subscribed, and I bet you have, but just in case you haven't, be sure to do that. As well as sew-alongs, lots of DIY. We have the pint-sized table runner series going right now, and much more to look forward to. I'll see you soon.